and then check her pulse and give her air.
Hello and welcome! Today's book review is gonna be a doozy. It is Tone Deaf by Olivia Rivers, and if you haven't guessed, I hated this book. I thought it's one of the worst things that I have read in a very long time. It's partly my fault because I had no clue what I was getting into. This has been on my TBR for ages, like years. I'd completely forgotten what the plot was, but I bought it, so I was gonna read it. The one thing that struck out to me that I remembered was that the main character is deaf, and I personally haven't seen many novels that are narrated by people with disabilities. I think the larger problem though is that this book started out as a Wattpad book. If you're around or aware in like the early 2010s, there was this craze in which traditional publishers picked up viral books from these self-publishing platforms and were like, we are going to publish that and bring it to the masses. However, we're not really going to do any editing. We're not going to improve it. No offense to indie authors, but there is a distinct difference in the quality of the writing and the quality of the book versus a traditionally published novel. Not that you don't have great ideas, not that you don't have a handle on how to write, but it tends to be really one-dimensional, cheesy. It's just not a quality book. And that is what this book suffered from. I actually read this book. I was going to Chicago, so I was like, perfect time to read a book. I read it on my iPad and I took all of these notes. You guys would be so proud of me because so often I'm like, oh, I forgot because I was listening to it and I was driving, so I couldn't write down notes. I literally, like, every other paragraph was making a note and asking questions or being like, meh, this doesn't make sense. I don't get it. I've talked before about the author raising questions and then eventually answering them and how that's a good thing. But what I found in this novel, which goes back to the self-published author, is that we don't necessarily know when we are posing questions or when we are or are not answering those questions. It just comes, again, back to the editing. I'm sure that this book, like, I read After by that Anna lady who wrote this fan fiction about One Direction. So I read the traditionally published version and I was like, this thing is terrible. So I said, well, maybe I will get a different perspective if I actually read the original Wattpad version. It was even worse. So I'm sure this book was even worse before it got picked up and edited. But it was very flat and the characters, like, okay, again, it's a romance, which that was my fault. We know I don't do romance. Like, I don't mind an underlying romance, but when it is straightforward romance, just doesn't speak to me. A lot of perfect storm moments for this book to fail. But I started skipping very, very quickly because there wasn't much depth to the content. Outside of the initial, like, let's get to know each other, it just felt like one moment connected to another moment, connected to another moment, and it's like whatever the author felt in her heart was what she was going to put on the page. And it didn't involve a lot of plotting and outlining. We had characters who had characteristics, but they didn't really mean anything. But I'll get into that later. Beginning of the novel, we meet Allie, who is at a Tone Deaf concert. Tone Deaf is like the big boy band, and their lead singer is Jace. They also have three other members, John, Arrow, and Killer. And can I just pause here? We got close, if not to, the very middle of the novel before we figured out why Arrow and Killer are called Arrow and Killer, which it doesn't sound like much, but if you're gonna have band members, like, I get it, you can have weird nicknames for your band members, but there's always a point where we learn what their real names are, because then that connects us to them as a character and brings us into their background. And this novel has two narrators, Jace and Allie. So you would have thought that, yes, Allie is going to refer to Arrow and Killer as Arrow and Killer because she's not necessarily a fangirl. She was at that concert because her best friend dragged her to it. But when we get to Jace, why, especially since I think Arrow is his cousin, why is he referring to Arrow as Arrow? I guess at some point that becomes their actual nickname, but still, like, I expected, at least for Killer, a much sooner explanation as to why he has this name. And can I say, I was a little disappointed. He apparently comes from England or maybe even some other country prior to that. So his parents named him Kilimanjaro, which eventually morphed into Killer. This is one of those things where I enjoy quirk, but this was like the author just wanted something super quirky, so let's call him Kilimanjaro. Arrow, at least I will accept, because it was funny coming off of how he learned how Killer got his name. He's like, I just had white trash parents who thought Arrow was a good name. I will take that. There's not much depth to it, but coming off the tail end of Killer's saga story, I will take it. River's first misstep for me is that we open with Allie at this concert. Actually, let me put a pause on that too and say, this did not feel like a book narrated by a deaf person. This felt like a book narrated by a person who happened to be deaf, which for me defeated the purpose because I wanted to know how it felt to be deaf. We get a lot of sign language. It took a millennia to figure out why she was deaf and then what that connection had to Jace. But I was like, I didn't feel like I was in the body or in the head of a deaf person. She did research. She gave credit to people in her acknowledgments, but it didn't feel like her character was deaf. I want to know what she hears. Like, I get it. Vibrations would alert her to things, and that's great. But it wasn't like she felt isolated and alone in herself, which, because Rivers didn't characterize Allie very well, I don't know if that's how a deaf person feels. And for me, that's just a miss because this is an educational moment for your reader. She also verbally talks. I get it. She wasn't born deaf. Spoiler, she became deaf because, well, first, she was like this piano prodigy who'd played Carnegie Hall and all this gag-worthy stuff. And then she started having some issues, goes to the doctor, and they're like, oh, you have a tumor. We need to take this tumor out before it causes permanent damage. She wakes up, and they're like, actually, tumor was larger than we thought, so to take it out, you lost your hearing. Again, I would love to know, is that how it actually works? I would like to dive deeper into that. But this book was really more about the romance between Allie and Jace. Maybe that was just my fault. I missed it because I didn't expect this to be a romance. But anyways, because she was like 10 or so when she lost her hearing, I can accept that that's why she would speak. But we did not learn any of this information until halfway, 3/4 into the novel. We do know that she wasn't born deaf, but we don't know the circumstances surrounding it. So why aren't you explaining this to me earlier? Because to me, that doesn't make sense. To me, like, I know that a deaf person can speak. There's no issue with them actually speaking. The problem with them speaking is they can't hear themselves. And so it comes out differently because we register what we say and how we say it by how we hear it. It's new, it's uncomfortable, it's perhaps nerve-wracking because they don't want to get it wrong. I don't really know. But also, they're probably in communities where nobody else speaks. So what's the point in speaking? None of this. Like, I have no idea. What is it like to be deaf? Because she acts and she lip reads well enough that she doesn't necessarily have to sign. And it doesn't seem to me that she actually signs that often. And I know some deaf people are not in a deaf community. Perhaps their entire family is hearing. They go to school at a hearing school, and so this is not part of their life. So they do learn how to adapt. But I had all these questions. Why can't you immerse me into this deaf culture? That's what drew me to your novel in the first place. But that's just me. If you were deaf, would you be like, I want to read that because that's me? Because that's why we read things. Well, we read things to get lost, but we also read things because we connect. We see ourselves. We all want to be represented. So it's like, I would want to see how I'm represented and how someone like me is being portrayed in the media. She's at this concert, and as I said, this was my first problem. I did not catch on to the fact that this concert was over. I don't mind where she started at this concert. I thought it was great because she immediately threw us into the action. But I thought it would have been better if we had experienced the concert with Allie. We had started the concert with her. Maybe this is the first concert she's been to since she was deaf. She's 17 now, so probably not. But it could also be that maybe she doesn't go to concerts because she has this internal struggle regarding music because of the potential she did have, which again, I was like, I would have loved, because we really get no explanation as to why she quits piano, except for the fact that she can no longer hear, which is valid. Again, this would have created depth of character and depth of novel. I would have loved to see more about that internal struggle, how it felt to no longer be able to play the piano the way she used to. And does she quit because she's angry? Does she quit because she's sad? Does she quit because she thinks she has to quit? Because she obviously has the knowledge in her head to the point that she doesn't need to hear it because she already knows what it sounds like. So, Beethoven, he was deaf and he made great music. It was a huge missed opportunity in character building and story building. We pick up with the end of the concert and Allie making all these judgment calls about everybody, which was another issue for me, guys. I get it. Maybe she's cynical. Maybe she, like me, is like, I don't want to go to a boy band. One, I don't like the boy band. Two, I'm not a boy band kind of person. Like, why are you dragging me to this except that you're my best friend? So I'm cool. I'm like, yes, be cynical. Judge all these people because that's what we do. We think something is stupid. I dug it. I was like, all right, girl, you get your personality out there and you tell me how you feel about everything that's going on around you. But the entire rest of the novel, she was this simpering, weak character who was afraid of everything, which I'll get to that later, so it's not necessarily invalid, but she had no personality. So I had no clue who she was. We are at the point at the end of this concert where the winner of a private backstage tour is being announced. Rivers really enjoys going into detailed information when she doesn't need to go into detailed information. So we get this long diatribe about the wristbands and how you have to have a wristband. If you take your wristband off, it's invalidated, and how Allie would love to just give her wristband to her best friend Avery, but she can't and she doesn't even want to win. The number goes up on screen and Avery is freaking out, and Allie's like, her dream came true, only for it to be Allie's wristband, which brought one of my first questions. How does Avery know what Allie's number is? These are like a long string of numbers. How does Avery know Allie won? Except that she's an obsessive fan, so maybe she memorized Allie's numbers, or maybe they were sequential, and so she's like, oh, well, if it's one off from mine, then it must be hers. Anyways, now Allie is going up to the booth where she's supposed to say, hey, I'm the winner. This is when it started to get a little disillusioned by her and her cynicism. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not a Swiftie. I'm not a fangirl of any sort. So maybe it's true that girls will try to pass themselves off as winners for things. But I was like, is this really how things go, or is this just how Rivers wants them to go because she wants to portray a certain kind of vibe? And of course, then the girl at the kiosk is super rude to her. She has better things to do than her job, which I don't know what day this girl had. It's stereotype upon cliche. Of course, then all these girls are giving her dirty looks, and yeah, it didn't set up a well-written novel. It set up as I'm a high schooler and I just wrote something that made me feel good, which there's nothing wrong with that, but a feel-good novel is not a good novel. She bids Avery farewell, and Avery's like, "You're gonna be okay, right?" And she's like, "Yeah." She's taken to the stage manager, whose name is Tony, and as soon as he learns she's deaf, he gives her this look. Okay, I get it. We're trying to foreshadow here. But there's no context for his behavior. Because actually what he does is, because she's speaking out loud, and he's like, "Oh, are you foreign?" She goes, "No, I'm just deaf." And he's like, or whatever he does. And I'm like, what about her disability would cause such a reaction? For me, that's one of my first clues that this novel was going to be very surface level. Then he's like, "All right, fine, let me go take you to see Jace because he's going to lead this backstage tour." Now she's getting all fangirly, which I'm like, okay, Beth, quit being a cynic yourself and just say, even if you're not a fan, you know, sometimes you get the nerves when it comes to meeting a celebrity. Anybody would feel that way. She gets up there and Jace is talking to Arrow. As soon as he learns that she's deaf, he gives her both fingers and walks away. And I'm like, obviously there's more than meets the eye going on here, but Arrow seems to be very sympathetic. So I'm like, okay, I like Arrow, I don't like Jace. We already know that Jace is a playboy with a bad attitude who's always in the press for negative things. We're getting characterization, we're figuring out who these guys are. Allie's like, "You know what? I don't really care. Just take me home." We go home and we learn that her dad is physically abusive towards her. Her mom had died at some point and she basically is still mourning that, and she just has a really bad home life situation. But she is like a secret coder at some point to pass the time or just to earn money. She has taught herself to code on this rickety old Mac. And guys, when I say rickety old Mac, I'm thinking original 80s box Mac. I know that's not what it is, but I'm just like, yes. And maybe it's not even a Mac. It could have been a PC for all I know. But she's also applied for a deaf university called Gallaudet. Please excuse my bad pronunciation. She has received early admissions letter, which her dad, when he finds out about it, gets extremely mad because apparently he can't cope with the fact that she's deaf, even though she came to live with him right when she became deaf because that's when her mother died, which I'll just spoil that right here. She has her surgery. They learn the bad news that there's nothing that could be done and she is deaf. Her mom goes to this coffee shop and on her way back, she gets hit by a car and dies. Of course, Allie blames herself to some extent because her mom was just trying to cope with this new reality. She was probably distracted and blah, 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 which again, such a cliche. We don't get enough guilt throughout this novel to then learn that, oh, Allie feels responsible. We hop into Jace. He's like brooding in his room. He's gotten a talking to by Tony, and now he's talking through these things with Arrow, and it's revealed that today of all days, why did he have to have a deaf girl thrown in his face when it's the 5th anniversary of his mother's death? And it's like, what does being deaf have to do with anything? Rivers, in trying to create suspense, has just done too much. Tony, in order to save face, because he's like, we have this tour and we cannot have it bombed by a fan telling the world how terrible Jace is. He convinces Jace to make amends by offering Allie money as well as the promised tour. Also, when we're with Jace, we learn that Arrow and Killer are actually in a relationship. And this is one of those things where it feels like Rivers was trying to be inclusive for inclusivity's sake, not because this is a defining characteristic for these two guys, and she wants to explore what it means. She's like, oh, well, as soon as Killer realized that Arrow was bi, he made his move. and they've been together ever since, and they're the perfect couple. This is like a punk rock pop kind of band where the guys seem to be like real hardcore, but then Killer and Arrow are super sensitive, nice guys. Not to say they can't be, but the persona of the band does not fit in with the persona of its members. Arrow and Killer can do whatever they want. I don't really care. But I would have preferred to have seen them a little gruffer. And then that then can play into this idea that, because this book was 2015, must have been in that area. The idea of inclusivity was not as prevalent as it is now. The fact that these guys in this rock band of sorts would have been gay probably wouldn't have gone over as well, and so they would have had to have kept it under wraps. Granted, I have no idea what the public knows, but I thought it would have been nice to have played into this idea of who they should be versus who they actually are. And then for them, that is their internal struggle. Like, they've accepted themselves, they have accepted their relationship, but they might still be worried about public perception, or they might still wrestle with, is this okay? Should I be doing this? And so maybe they're not necessarily in a relationship. Maybe they're in an off and on relationship instead of being like an old married couple that is perfect for each other. So I thought there were ways that Rivers could have just tweaked her characters and her storylines to give it a little bit more depth. Arrow's a jerk. Killer is actually the one who's really nice, and in the end, he's the one who is accepting of Allie. Okay, so Arrow at first, when Jace flips Allie off, is the one who kind of is sympathetic towards her. But then when we get further into things, and spoiler-ish, Jace invites Allie to go on tour with them to escape her dad. Arrow's the one who's not accepting of it and is angry when he hears about it. So I'm like, who is Arrow? Because we really don't get much of Arrow. We get a lot of Killer. We get a lot of Jace, but we don't get much of Arrow at all. You can't have this one guy behave one way and then behave this other way and then give no explanation except that, yeah, he's looking out for the band and he's looking out for Jace. I thought his behavior was odd. We're back with Allie. She's hanging out with Avery and she gets the text. How did Jace get her number? I think they explained it, but still. This is weird. Couldn't he have called her? They're teenagers. I guess texting's what it's all about, and maybe this would have scared her less. But I would have thought if he's going by his manager's advice, who also does their PR, the right thing to do would have been to call her, not just like randomly text her. He offers her money, and in the end, she's like, I will do it because I want to go to New York anyways to get away from my dad, even though I'm a minor, and this is technically considered kidnapping and is illegal. By the time I get to New York, I will be 18, and this is a far better option than trying to figure out how to do it on my own. Plus, the more money he gives me, the easier things will be at the end of the line. He talks her into it, and she doesn't tell Avery. All she does is she tells Avery that she's going to go on the tour. She's on this tour. He's still really cynical. I think at this point, he does reveal that he knows sign language, and I'm still like, what does being deaf have to do with anything? The one thing that Rivers does do is she gives a note saying it's difficult to show sign language. So what I'm gonna do is when they're signing, it will be italicized, and when they're speaking, it will obviously be in quotations. I could have used a whole lot more signing personally, but whatever. If Allie is more comfortable speaking than signing, then go for it. Because even Avery, which I was like, I don't know how believable this is, because I think she and Avery met. They've been friends for like 4 or 5 years. And so Avery was like, I'm gonna learn sign language for you. Apparently she's just as, if not more fluent than Allie. I mean, because Allie doesn't really want to put a lot of effort, and she complains about how nobody really cared about the fact that she was deaf and she needed assistance. This whole being deaf thing, it fell flat. This is where she reveals to Jace that she has musical knowledge, but of course, because she's deaf, there's no way that she can do what she says she can. The next thing we know, she has run away from her dad's house, and she had this long, hot trek to the stadium, and she's second guessing, self-doubting. Jace meets her and she's like, well, how are you gonna get me past all these people because they're packing up to go to the next location? He's like, I'm at the back, nobody will see you, which is not wrong. She gets there, he's already warned his bandmates, and Arrow is in a huff, but they have agreed not to let Tony know because Tony will alert the authorities and all this good stuff. I will say, I thought that John was an unnecessary part of their band because honestly, I thought he was going to do something or attempt something with Allie, or that he was going to be a turncoat and he was going to rat on them. No, but he did show up literally in the last 5 or 6 chapters of the novel. So there you go. She gets to his RV, and I also was like, okay, so where is she gonna sleep? Have we thought this through? Is she gonna sleep in the bed? Is she gonna sleep on the couch? Is there another room? This was not a very well thought out plan, which obviously, and I can accept that. I would have liked to have seen this from Jace, where Jace, because he had seen from their tour pictures taken, and he realized that Allie had been abused. Apparently, he's been abused too, but Rivers is so vague, and it takes her forever to reveal anything. So he goes from a jerkwad to like her personal savior, and can I just tell you, it took 7 days from the first point of meeting for them to get into a relationship. I know they're in close quarters. She could not stand him. He could not stand her. Her deafness was an affront to him. So I guess something about sharing this abuse melted his stone cold heart. I wouldn't know because my stone cold heart has yet to melt. She's now on his tour bus. He's like, got some stuff to do, you take a nap. Oh, I gotta also put a little pin in here and say, I guess Jace, in his attempts to have control in his life, and then, spoiler-ish, to prevent himself from becoming his dad, has become a health freak. He's very into fitness and healthy eating, which there's nothing wrong with that. But again, just like where is she gonna sleep, I would have liked to have seen him put down the phone after their text messaging and be like, what did I just do? How is this going to work? Where's she gonna stay? Is she gonna like my kind of food? Because it's essentially rabbit food. Like, it's not food that people are just like, yes, thank you. Obviously, when you're hungry, you're hungry. There are all these little factors that I would have liked to have seen. It builds his character. It builds the story. It builds the drama. Instead of just being very surface level. It was very formulaic and downright boring. He's like, I've got some things to do. You hang out here. She goes and she crashes in his room for like 8 hours. And apparently she sleeps all the time. Not only did I feel like the deaf aspect of this novel was underdeveloped, I thought that the physical abuse aspect of this novel was underdeveloped. It was given more time, but Jace at one point is kind of worried about the amount of time Allie spends sleeping. But then he's like, well, I do remember that when I was being abused, I was so worried at night that I could never get a full night's sleep. So maybe she's just really tired. This observation of his, I felt was like the tip of the iceberg. I feel like Rivers had good thoughts. She didn't quite know how to tap into fully. But they work it out and that she'll sleep on the couch and he will sleep in his room. He does have a pit bull named Cuddles, who he had rescued from a dog fighter. Cuddles had lost and was going to be killed, but then Cuddles ran away and Jace found it, and Cuddles is not a vicious pit bull, but Allie is terrified. Allie had been attacked by a dog at some point. This really just served as a moment because I think Killer noticed her fear of this dog and he was like, oh, you've been attacked. And of course, her first thought is her dad and like, what has Jace been saying, when really just what he meant was you've had an encounter with a dog. There's just so much going on here that it was monotonous. It just wasn't well written. There was not much engagement for me. Let's just get ahead of it. All she does is spend her time on this RV. She has taken over Jace's social media and she has begun using his computer to code. He's like coding while he's watching the news, and there's an Amber Alert for her. In that Amber Alert, it is stated that she has a mental illness. Here, let me just give you some insight. Her dad was an alcoholic, or is an alcoholic. He had been the chief of police. Nobody ever believed her when she said she was being abused, because why would they believe her when he was the chief of police and he has all this respect? Avery believed her. Avery's parents believed her, but no doctor, no teacher, nobody would come forward. At some point, she was labeled by doctors because she just kept saying, hey, he's abusing me. They labeled her as having a mental illness. What would you know? But Jace automatically is like, she lied to me. And come on now. Have we learned nothing here? You have begun to bond with her. I like the idea that now he's second guessing his choice, because we do need moments of uncertainty. We do need moments where we as the reader are unsure as to how this novel is going to now proceed. But he was so quick to believe a news source rather than the instinct that prompted him to invite her to run away and get on their tour bus. Of course, now, Arrow in particular, and I think maybe even Killer, are like, did you watch the news? Oh my gosh, what have we done? This was such a stupid idea. Why do you trust her? She then freaks out, which I was just like, oh my gosh. And now we have the damsel in distress. She runs into the bathroom. He follows her and she acts like she's afraid he's gonna hit her. Which, okay, maybe that's a valid reaction. But because they're so underdeveloped, it felt like, oh no, I'm sad, and create drama for the novel. I'm just gonna cower. I don't know, because like she didn't develop this idea of abuse well enough. Of course, Jace is like, how could I have ever doubted her? Then we have a moment where she has nightmares and he comes and he comforts her. And of course, this is when they start not sleeping together, but sleeping together. That's when their relationship starts, because I think Arrow or someone finds them cuddled up together and he's like, are you guys in a relationship? And Jace is like, yeah, I think we are. Does she know this? Because it doesn't seem to me like they had a conversation. It seems to me that you comforted her, you guys cuddled all night, and now you think you're in a relationship. But they are. They're in a relationship. To give you context on Jace's situation, both of his parents were deaf, which I gathered that his mom was deaf. And I was like, so your deaf mom dying is enough to cause trauma so that when you run into a deaf girl, you flick her off. Okay. He grew up in this household. His father had some sort of mental disability, like he was mentally unstable, and he had PTSD from something. Perhaps because he's deaf? Does Rivers get into that? Absolutely not. We just are given a flat, oh, dad had a mental issue, he's deaf, he was abusive. And he has PTSD, which is why he's abusive. The mother inadvertently dies at the father's hands. I couldn't tell you why. I'm not about to go back to the book to figure it out. Now he's left with a father who is abusive. Nothing is done about it. He then forms this band, and his dad is so upset with him that he attacks him and cuts him with a broken beer bottle. This is what then sends him to jail. Jace wants nothing more to do with him, which Allie actually posed a really good question about, do you have any sort of contact or relationship with him? And Jace is like, no. That could have actually been a really good opening to dive into Jace, but we're not going there apparently. This is what I mean by he's like, if I can control this one healthy aspect of my life, I will never suffer from this unhealthy behavior or mental disability that my father had. He does not drink, he does not do drugs. He goes off to do this promo for the band, and when he comes back, Allie's like, why have you been drinking? He's like, I haven't been drinking. She's like, yeah, you have. He falls to the ground and he starts seizing. They have given her 2 phones. One is a burner, which she can use to contact Avery. The other is just a regular phone that she can use to get in touch with guys from the band, because obviously a burner can't be traced, so why would she text from a regular phone? Anyways, she's like, oh my gosh, I need to call 911, but if I call 911, they're gonna trace it back to me, they're gonna find me. She messages the band, Jace is having a seizure, you need to call 911. Wouldn't you know it, they still catch her, and they're like, that's the girl that's been on the news. So they hand her over to the cops, who then ship her back to LA. Jace wakes up, he learns that he was roofied. And he's like, oh my gosh, I thought that I would avoid that by not drinking, but I guess they're still gonna roofie my soft drink, or whatever he was drinking. This again, kind of pointless. It was a plot device that led somewhere else, but why aren't we diving into the fact that he was roofied? Why was he roofied? Who roofied him? And all we get is, we're probably never gonna find out. We get to LA, her dad is standing there. Oh, this is not gonna go well. She tries to escape and he won't let her, only for the cops to come and arrest him, because Jace, after waking up from his coma, convinces people to come forward for her. So enough people have come forward that the police finally believe her and they arrest him. Avery, her parents, are gonna become Allie's legal guardians until she turns 18. Epilogue, 8 months later, Allie and Jace are living the love. She's still helping them write songs, she's doing his social media, and she's going to Gallaudet. Something that I forgot to mention is that because she was a child prodigy and she can still hear the music, Jace had the perfect song. Like, that was what he labeled it. This was going to be his perfect song, but he could never get it perfect. Allie stumbles across this sacred notebook and she's like, I know I shouldn't open it, but I will. She stumbles across his perfect song and rewrites it. She tweaks it. And then what do you know? She falls asleep and he finds her. He finds the notebook. He's pissed, and rightfully so. Look, this was his private notebook. You shouldn't have touched it. So if he's gonna be mad, I'll be mad with him, because no respect for boundaries here. But then when he reads it, he's like, oh my gosh, she's a genius. She really must have been a piano prodigy. He's also been doing all this in-depth research into the lyrics for their songs. And she's like, oh my gosh, he's this amazing lyricist. And then Killer, whoever, is like, yeah, he's like a really good musician too. He gets it. Oh my gosh. All these perfect points and no flaws, except that he used to be a jerk and now he's not. She really has no character flaws. She's just a damsel in distress that needs to be saved. This book was horrendous. I could skim, and because it's so formulaic and follows the structure, that I'm like, okay, here's about a time that something's gonna be good. Or you could like pick out a sentence and be like, okay, this is going to be a point that I need to pay attention. But honestly, the dialogue, not necessarily bad. Maybe for the average reader, this is not a bad book. It's kind of along the lines of Twilight, where it's somebody's guilty pleasure. It's that whole idea of like the bad boy rock star and the needy regular girl coming together against all odds. Why did I waste my time? I would just put the vomit emoji to save myself time. Yes, it was so repetitive in my comments that, yeah, that's really gonna cover it. It was a sick emoji symbol. There we go. Have you read this book? Do you have any recommendations of books narrated by a person with a disability that you would recommend to me? There we go. Bye.